having me. As was mentioned, my name is Blair Scorgie. I'm a registered professional planner, urban designer. I'm the managing principal of a practice called Scorgie Planning. I'm also an adjunct professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University. And like my friend Daniel Kolominsky, I also feel compelled to share that I am not planning on running for office this term, despite the requests of some individuals in this room. So my presentation today is called Looking Forward to Transit Station Areas. Toronto is at a really interesting point in its housing reform process. With respect to MTSAs, a lot of the policy debate has already happened. The stations have been approved. Permissions have been modified by the province, and the conversation is now shifting from, whether growth should happen near transit to how that growth is translated into rules that can actually be used. So this is a different kind of planning problem than I think we're used to. I've spent the last 10 years just trying to fight for policy reform. It's less about the idea of transit-oriented growth and more about the mechanics of getting from policy to actual implementation and construction of buildings, right? So we're asking questions like, where do permissions apply? Which existing standards are still going to matter? Which ones need to give way? And how do we write zoning that's clear enough for staff as well as applicants and council to understand and interpret? For this summit, one important part of that question is what MTSA zoning means for the missing middle and mid-scale housing layers in neighborhoods specifically, right? So the background matters, but it's not really the center of the talk. The center is implementation now. So can the rules be translated into zoning that actually helps deliver housing near transit? So why this matters now. So on August 15th, 2025, the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing approved 6 Toronto official plan amendments and delineated and implemented 120 major transit station areas and protected major transit station areas across the city, centered on subway, GO, and LRT stations. The minister also modified the city-approved OPAs to increase the densities and heights that are permitted within these station areas. The province framed those as changes as part of a larger housing capacity exercise. Whether or not the eventual delivery of that housing matches that ambition remains to be seen. But the direction is clear, right? So station areas are now expected to do a lot more of the heavy lifting. The city has now translated that policy structure into zoning. Zoning item, and I can attest to, in speaking with Jason Thorne, I know that he's redirected a significant amount of staff and time resources towards this specific thing over the last several months. And so the zoning recommendations prepared by city planning are expected to come forward to Planning and Housing Committee in June, which is a few weeks away, okay? So station areas are about to become more than policy geographies. They're about to become zoning standards, right? That also makes this political. So these permissions are not, they're not on lands that are, they're not gonna land as abstract growth management exercises. They're gonna affect lands in actual wards on streets that people know, near houses, apartments, stores, schools, laneways, ravines, parking lots, and transit stations that already carry a lot of local meaning, right? So this is also an election year. And there's resistance to EHON-related changes, particularly in parts of the inner suburbs that are felt by local politicians and residents. So, it certainly doesn't undermine or lessen the significance of these reforms, but it does shape the conditions under which the first package of zoning amendments will be considered, right? There's gonna be concerns, there's gonna be pushback. That's probably not surprising to anybody in the room, right? The first zoning package has to do things at once. It has to implement the approved MTSC policies in a faithful way and in enough to matter, really, but it still has to be understood as one major step in an ongoing process rather than the final word around every station area and what can happen there. So just when we look at the map, these are the 120 MTSAs that we're talking about, okay? Okay, so what MTSA zoning has to implement? So one reason this is difficult is that MTSA policies do not translate simply into one zoning permission. There's 120 station areas, as I said, implemented through Chapter 8 of the official plan and site-specific policies. So they also overlap with various land use designations, secondary plans, major streets, avenues, existing zoning categories, and site-specific standards and Chapter 900 exceptions, right? So within that structure, the province modified permissions create a hierarchy of intensity, right? So on large sites that can accommodate 3 or more towers that are designated either as mixed-use areas, apartment neighborhoods, or regeneration areas, the rules require permissions for buildings up to 30 stories within 200 meters of a station or 20 stories between 200 and 500 meters of a station. On other sites with those same designations, the zoning has to permit 8 times FSI within 200 meters of a station or 6 between 200 and 500 meters. Then there's the neighborhoods layer, which I'm sure is probably most interest to everybody in this room. On lands designated neighborhoods, the policies require residential buildings up to 6 stories within 200 meters of the station, as well as residential buildings up to 4 stories everywhere else within major transit station areas. So that range is significant, right? MTA zoning is not just about towers and stations. It has to translate a full built form hierarchy into the zoning bylaw. Towers in some places, high density permissions in others, a neighborhood layer that sort of includes 4-story multiplexes and apartment buildings right up to 6-story apartment buildings, right? In practice, many of these places are transition zones. They're not simply tower sites, they're not simply stable low-rise areas, but they're the edges where zoning has to make different housing forms work together, right? So the zoning translation problem. So this is where the work gets difficult. So the official plan permissions and zoning implementation are not the same thing, right? So the official plan establishes the policy direction, but the zoning determines what that direction means on an actual parcel by parcel basis, right? So station areas do not sit on a blank map. As we mentioned, they sit on top of existing zones, exceptions, overlays, secondary plans, SASPs, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those rules may still make sense. Some may need to be superseded. Some may need to be recalibrated because they were written prior to MTSA-based intensification thinking, right? Put differently, this is a faithful implementation exercise. The zoning should implement the minimum permissions established through the approved official plan amendments without reintroducing indirect or discretionary barriers that functionally frustrate those types of permissions, right? That sounds technical, and it is, but it comes very practical when we start to talk about it in terms of like different performance standards like height, density, setbacks, etc. The built form matters. It's not going to disappear, but we need to regulate form, and we also need to provide things like safe access, safety, livability, and appropriate transition, right? So the question is, whether they do not is not whether they work as form shaping tools or whether they quietly become de facto density caps. It's like, do they eventually kind of get in the way of helping us achieve the types of things that we say that we want, right? So a permission could look significant at a policy level and still be hard to use, right? So for MTSA zoning, the issue is not just where the city implements the numbers and how, it's whether the zoning creates development frameworks that can actually function on the ground, right? So the neighborhood implication. For this summit, as I mentioned, the neighborhood piece is probably the most interesting and relevant, right? So Toronto's often talked about housing through a fairly blunt contrast of low-rise neighborhoods on one side, towers and station areas on the other side, right? In centers and et cetera. But a lot of the city's housing potential, as we all know, sits somewhere between those two conditions, right? So in the MTSA neighborhoods context, that includes, as I mentioned, 4-story multiplexes and apartment buildings, as well as 6-story apartment buildings on major streets and within 200 meters of a station. Some may look like larger multiplexes, some may look like walk-up apartments or small, hopefully, and I don't know if Conrad's here yet, but like hopefully Conrad can get the rules changed and we can actually have single egress buildings. That would unlock a lot of potential at this scale. And some are gonna be, small to mid-rise apartment buildings, right? The MTSA policies bring that layer directly into the station area zoning exercise. So in neighborhoods, it's not going to be just about whether we can add more units to existing house form buildings that are permitted. It's also whether apartment buildings can become a normal part of the transit area housing pattern, right? So that doesn't mean that every lot can necessarily accommodate a 6-story building. But the zoning has to treat the 4 to 6-story layer as a real set of building types, not just as a set of abstract permissions. It also means paying attention to height, form, and unit layout together, right? A 4-story multiplex permission does not mean much if unit permissions remain too constrained to use the permitted envelope. And a 6-story apartment permission doesn't mean much if performance standards make the building difficult to design or finance, right? So we do not yet know exactly how the city is planning on calibrating unit counts within MTSAs, including whether permissions for up to 6 units in a multiplex will be expanded or adjusted. That's something that's potentially on the table, but the calibration of it is going to matter, right? Consolidation, not stacking. So I'm running short on time here. I'll try to be quick. But we've got 120 MTSAs, PMTSAs. In all of them, we've got major streets. In 102 of them, we've got avenues. So it's not a clean exercise of where each policy tool gets its own geography, right? So we've got all these overlapping things. A useful principle here is consolidation and not stacking. Where these policies overlap, zoning should rationalize the applicable standards rather than layering separate regimes in a way that creates cumulative constraints, right? If this is done well, the reforms can create a more continuous housing spectrum, right? If they're not done well, the result can be uncertainty, duplication, and inconsistency in interpretation, right? This is just a concept showing what an MTSA build-out could look like. Then finally, the delivery test. Okay, so the final point here is that MTS zoning will ultimately be judged by delivery. So the zoning can say 4 stories or 6 stories. It can say multiplexes and apartment buildings are permitted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, those permissions matter, but they're only a starting point. You know, within the MTSAs, as mentioned by Chris earlier, you know, minimum parking requirements are no longer in effect, and that's a significant change. But the delivery question is more broader than parking, right? So are the standards clear enough to use? Are they predictable enough to finance? Are they calibrated closely enough for, you know, to real property building types that projects can move from policy permission to approval and construction? That's especially important for missing middle and mid-scale housing where feasibility can be fragile, right? So for small-scale buildings, things like unit yield, setbacks, angular planes, lot coverage, et cetera, you know, can create a significant amount of approvals that will determine whether or not a project is viable or not, right? If the zoning is undercalibrated, implementation pressure will shift back to minor variances, site-specific rezonings, and discretionary interpretation. So the goal of this should be permission-forward zoning that reduces the need for case-by-case correction. At the same time, it's important to be realistic about the first round of zoning. What council approves through this first package is unlikely to be perfect. Given the deadline and political context, the package may include carve-outs, exemptions, or deferred matters to get a baseline adopted on time. It's also likely to rely on existing multiplex and apartment building standards rather than substantially reworking them. That's just reasonable, given the context, right? From there, the city will need to monitor how the regulations perform, report back to council, and adjust where zoning is under-delivering, creating unnecessary friction, or drifting from the intent of MTSA policies. So the next stage will not be measured by whether Toronto gets the zoning perfect on the first attempt. It's going to be measured by whether the city can adopt a clear baseline, monitor it, and keep adjusting the rules so transit-oriented housing becomes less exceptional and more ordinary over time. Thanks very much.